So you can't expect the world, if you're going on anabolic androgenic steroids or selective androgen receptor modulators, something has got to give. Vigorous Steve here with the Vigorous Q&A, answering all of your bodybuilding related questions. Sorry it took a little while, I had some Flurona to beat, but I'm happy to announce that as of this morning, I'm completely Flurona free. I did 2 rapid tests and I'm negative on both of them. So I'm back to the Vigorous Q&A, answering all of your questions. Over the course of this week, we had 120 comments in the Vigorous Q&A posted on my Instagram page about a week ago. So sorry for the delay. I'll pick up the slack and answer the majority of them. I might have to combine several questions into a single video because many of the questions are kind of overlapping. So I might as well hit all of the stones with one bird. Wait, that's the other way around. Never mind. Still, the Flurona is giving me brain fog. So let's just get into the question. Today's question is from Dalton MKS. Does all gear cause negative feedback to the hypothalamus pituitary testes axis in the same manner? And yes, Dalton, they most certainly do. All gear that potentiates their effect through the androgen receptor shuts you down exactly the same way. Before we get into the rest of the answer, please like the video or leave a comment for the algorithm. And consider subscribing if you haven't already and hit the notification bell button while you're at it so you can get notified whenever a new video drops. Now, regarding the downregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary testes axis, all steroids and selective androgen receptor modulators downregulate natural and endogenous testosterone production in the same manner through the androgen receptor. But you have progesterogenic 19-nors, which can also activate the progesterone receptor. And of course, there are progesterogenic 19-nors which promote the conversion of testosterone into estradiol. Testosterone itself converts into estradiol. And then there's the Anabol, which aromatizes into methyl estradiol, which is similar to estradiol, albeit methylated. In some individuals, albeit quite rare, Boldenone seems to increase esterone concentrations, which metabolizes into estradiol downstream. And then there's Anadrol, which is said to interact with the estrogen alpha or beta receptors. So these compounds can shut you down not only through the androgen receptor, which is present in the hypothalamus and the pituitary, but also through the estrogen and progesterone receptor. So let's say you take a combination of test and nandrolone and you don't control your estradiol levels with an aromatase inhibitor or a reversely binding dihydrotestosterone derivative. Test and nandrolone will shut you down through 3 different pathways: the androgen receptors, the progesterone receptors, and the estrogen alpha and beta receptors. And feel free to separate that because there's actually 2 estrogen receptors, being the alpha and the beta. Now, we can take turkesterone and ecdysterone in this example, which potentiates anabolism through the estrogen beta receptor pathway. These 2 compounds don't shut you down because they don't stimulate the androgen receptor or the progesterone receptor and seem to have very little affinity for the estrogen alpha receptor. Purely the estrogen beta receptor is what they activate. So if you take turkesterone and ecdysterone solo, getting a little bit of anabolism out of this unique pathway, regardless of dose, the hypothalamic to the pituitary signal releasing gonadotropic hormone releasing hormone and the pituitary releasing luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone that the testicles respond to, in this unique instance, there's no HPTA downregulation at any dose. I know people that took up to 300 milligrams turkesterone plus 300 milligrams ecdysterone, so that's 600 milligrams of these unique compounds potentiating effects of the estrogen beta receptor. Together, no HPTA downregulation. LH and FSH levels are still comparable to where they were before adding these compounds in. So from that, we can extrapolate, albeit slightly dubious extrapolation, is that HPTA downregulation doesn't occur when anabolism is potentiated through the estrogen beta receptors. Purely the estrogen alpha receptors, where estradiol and perhaps anadrol seems to attach to, causing downregulation. And we can further confirm that selective estrogen receptor modulators, which seem to have a higher affinity for the estrogen alpha receptor over the estrogen beta receptor, selective estrogen receptor modulators are traditionally used to block the estrogen receptors in the hypothalamus and the pituitary, which over time will restore HPTA functioning. And that be the same as endogenous testosterone production before, introducing exogenous testosterone or other performance-enhancing drugs that shut you down? Probably not. Again, a significant time probably has passed if you follow a blasting and cruising approach. And even if you only did one cycle, if you downregulate your HPTA through 3 different pathways, one of them being the progesterone receptor, if nandrolone, trenbolone, testosterone is still present while you're following a post-cycle therapy, you shouldn't expect full recovery because you still have supraphysiological amounts of progesterone-like compounds in your system, which is going to inhibit sufficient gonadotropin hormone releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone secretion. So you have a lazy HPTA, sort to say, and it might take months before these progestogenic 19-nors have metabolized from your system. So if you did use those compounds in your cycle, you might want to do a TRT bridge for several months, allowing these progestogenic 19-nors to metabolize and clear from your system, allowing you to have a successful outcome when you do follow a post-cycle therapy involving selective estrogen receptor modulators, which are blocking the estrogen alpha receptors. And there's no negative feedback through the androgen receptor or the progesterone receptor because all of the steroids and their metabolites have already left your system. I made a very detailed video about how to PCT correctly. I'll link it at the end of this one. Now, there's something we all have to keep in mind here is that there's a dose-dependent downregulation. Let's say your endogenous testosterone levels are 600 nanograms per deciliter, and you add in exogenous testosterone, replacing some of your endogenous testosterone, but ending up at a lower number, let's say 400 nanograms per deciliter, will you still get downregulation? Will you get adequate LH and FSH secretion for this difference of 200 nanograms per deciliter to kind of backfill from your HPTA? And unfortunately, it doesn't work like that because exogenous testosterone, whether you take suspension or testosterone undecanoate and anything in between, because it's not very pulsatile. If you take testosterone suspension, it will still take some time for it to leave the injection depot, end up in systemic circulation, and ultimately attach to the androgen receptors in the hypothalamus and the pituitary, downregulating the HPTA entirely. This is not anywhere close to how the HPTA actually works, which is pulsatile. It releases hormones in a pulsatile fashion. The hypothalamus secretes gonadotropic hormone releasing hormone in a pulsatile fashion, to which the pituitary responds by releasing luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone in a pulsatile fashion as well, to which the testicles respond by releasing testosterone, yes, in a pulsatile fashion. That's why your serum testosterone concentrations are generally the highest upon waking and then slowly decline over the day. With exogenous testosterone administrations, serum levels are kind of stable. They fluctuate maybe over a 24-hour period, especially if you do daily micro-administrations. You see that levels are quite stable. But when you look at a testosterone concentration graph of endogenous testosterone levels, it kind of goes up and it comes down. It peaks a little bit in the afternoon. It comes down again and then it goes up, right? It's pulsatile over the day. And that's why replacing endogenous testosterone production with exogenous testosterone, even if serum concentrations end up being lower, will still shut down your HPTA. And you see it with guys that have decent testosterone levels and they go on some cookie cutter shit brand, an underground lab that really messes up the production process or just has shit quality products. Let's say they inject 25 milligrams, 50 milligrams testosterone enanthate per week, is expecting to inject 250 milligrams per week just because the product is so shit. So now they end up at subclinical testosterone levels, and their LH and FSH production is completely bottomed out because exogenous testosterone doesn't pulse in the same fashion as endogenous testosterone production. Now, there might be something to say for Proviron. Proviron at a low dose of, let's say, 6.25 to 12.5 milligrams once or twice per day in some individuals doesn't downregulate the HPTA, purely because Proviron seems to attach to the sexual hormone-binding globulin and doesn't potentiate any effects or very little effects through the androgen receptors. So in this unique instance, even though Proviron is classified as an anabolic androgenic steroid, potentiating very little anabolic effects, that might be a suitable add-on on top of your endogenous testosterone production if your sexual hormone-binding globulin levels are too high for comfort and it's affecting your libido. An added benefit of Proviron is that it is a reversely binding aromatase inhibitor, reducing the conversion of testosterone into estradiol and thus lowering estradiol concentrations in the bloodstream might actually lower its negative effect that it has on the pulsatile secretion of GnRH, LH, and FSH. So you might get an added benefit by upregulating your HPTA by lowering your estradiol concentrations. Again, this is at very low dosages of 6.25 milligrams to 12.5 milligrams once to twice per day. So there's a dosage range of 6.25 milligrams up to 25 milligrams Proviron per day. And still, not everybody responds to this favorably. So in this unique instance, Proviron might be the only compound that doesn't downregulate the HPTA. Now, I know what you guys are going to say. What about selective androgen receptor modulators? Yes, they don't downregulate the HPTA if they're taken in single-digit dosages. But the main problem here is that selective androgen receptor modulators are far from selective when used in the dosages that bodybuilders use them in. When you want anabolism out of SARMs, the dosages are 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams, 30 milligrams, maybe even higher. But the selectivity dosages are in the single digits. 1 milligram, 2 milligrams, 6 milligrams, perhaps. These are the dosages that are being investigated in clinical settings, clinical studies. Most of them have already been abandoned because they don't see the efficacy of a 1 milligram or 2 milligram dose of ostarine regarding the particular medical settings that they're being investigated in which case maybe an Anavar is still more beneficial to resolve that particular medical condition. Again, I haven't really dived into it because I think that selective androgen receptor modulators are just a poor man drug. And with all the clinical evidence that we have on anabolic androgenic steroids, I don't see a reason to replace those in any way, shape, or form. So with selective androgen receptor modulators, there's a dose-dependent selectivity, just like nebivolol, a beta blocker, has a dose-dependent selectivity. 2.5 milligrams nebivolol is beta-1 adrenergic receptor selective. At this dose, it only blocks the beta-1 receptors of cardiac tissue, lowering heart rate and blood pressure accordingly. This is still observed at 5 milligrams nebivolol per day, up to 10 milligrams nebivolol per day. But if you go over 10 milligrams nebivolol per day, this selectivity is lost, and nebivolol starts to block the beta-2 adrenergic receptors as well. So if you go up to 20 milligrams nebivolol per day, you can bet your left testicle that you're going to get fat out of that because now your heart rate is lowered, but you're losing out on some of this adrenergic response through the beta-2 receptors, which is usually associated with fat loss and fat metabolism. So keep that in mind, it's the dose that determines the selectivity. And that's why you see with SERMs at dosages where people actually get an anabolic response, 10 milligrams or upwards, is that the HPTA still downregulates. Now, you would be able to say, well, can I combine all of the SERMs at their clinical dosages of 1 to 2 milligrams, get some sort of anabolism out of that without HPTA downregulation? Perhaps, potentially. I haven't seen anybody's blood work doing something like this. What I will say is that Anavar in women, from the blood work that I've seen, also has a dose-dependent downregulation. So in my wife, for example, 2.5 milligrams Anavar per day didn't really do anything to her LH and FSH levels. Her DHA sulfate levels remained very similar. Her testosterone levels did come down after adding in 2.5 milligrams of Anavar per day, but her estradiol levels stayed very comparable as well. So I would say that there's no clear indication of HPTA downregulation. Neither did that occur at 5 milligrams Anavar per day. But when she experimented with 10 milligrams Anavar per day, her LH and FSH levels went down. So did her DHA sulfate levels. So did her serum testosterone levels, at which point I would say that she's towards the bottom of the reference range, whereas before, without Anavar in the picture, her serum testosterone levels would actually be out of the reference range slightly. And keep in mind that the hypothalamus pituitary ovarian axis of women seems to be a lot more resilient to estrogens and androgens compared to men. When you look at serum estrogen concentrations in women, they're far higher than you would ever see in men, unless they're really megadosing the testosterone and nandrolone without an aromatase inhibitor, in which case you would have complete HPTA downregulation. But when you see a woman's serum estradiol concentrations into the hundreds, 200s, 300 picograms per milliliter even, depending on the phase of their menstrual cycle, luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone are perfectly within their respective reference ranges. So the HPOA of women seems to be more resilient to higher estrogen and androgen levels compared to men. Again, a testosterone level that is representative of men would completely downregulate a woman's HPOA, and an estrogen level in men that's representative of a woman would completely downregulate the HPTA. So again, stay within your sex-dependent reference range if you want to have a normal functioning HPTA. Now, there's even something to say about Trenbolone being selective at lower dosages. I believe that's even investigated. So I do feel that there's some dose-dependent selectivity preventing HPTA downregulation when men use particular performance-enhancing drugs. And the same can be said for women, but that's going to be uniquely individual. So women might respond well just to Anavar at a low dose of 2.5 to 5 milligrams per day and don't really experience HPOA downregulation, normal estrogen, normal DHEA sulfate, maybe slightly lower testosterone levels, but normal within the reference range LH and FSH levels. And with men, maybe a single milligram dose of a selective androgen receptor modulator, or perhaps a low dose of Proviron, which wouldn't have a negative effect on your HPTA, or any dose of Turkesterone or Ecdysterone. Again, they're not going to compare to anabolic androgenic steroids or selective androgen receptor modulators, but if you don't want HPTA downregulation, those seem to be the only two compounds that don't potentiate downregulating effects while still offering some sort of anabolism. So there's very limited compound selection that we have at our disposal that won't downregulate the HPTA. You can sustain some of the HPTA with using ACG or HMG. I don't believe in enclomiphene therapy or clomiphene therapy while you're using anabolic androgenic steroids because, again, the anabolic androgenic steroids or the selective androgen receptor modulators potentiate shutdown through the androgen receptor, and clomiphene or enclomiphene treatment alongside of these compounds will only block the estrogen alpha receptors. So how much of an effect, how much luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone you can expect if you're blocking the estrogen alpha receptors, probably still subclinical. Again, I've seen blood work on people using enclomiphene with TRT and nothing else. This is clinical TRT, 100 to 125 milligrams testosterone per week for levels somewhere at the top of the reference range. In this case, enclomiphene or Clomid might work to keep LH and FSH levels somewhat in check and sustain testicular functioning through that pathway. Still, I would prefer ACG or HMG or both to sustain testicular functioning. Biology is kind of against us in this sense, so you can't expect the world, if you're going on anabolic androgenic steroids or selective androgen receptor modulators, something has got to give. In most cases, that's going to be your HPTA. And if your HPTA was already lazy and your testosterone levels were subclinical, then why even bother trying to sustain it? You go on exogenous testosterone, you improve your overall quality of life and everything else that's associated with supraphysiological testosterone levels. And then you forget about your hypothalamus and your pituitary, and feel free to sustain your testicular functioning with ACG or HMG. I think that pretty much covers your question. Again, if you don't want permanent or long-term HPTA downregulation, stay away from the tren, the nandrolone, and the trestellone. Again, trestellone was developed as a male contraceptive. These three compounds will shut you down really, really hard, besides the androgen receptor, also through the progesterone receptor, and due to the longer ester formulations or some of the metabolites, might still shut you down and prevent HPTA recovery for weeks, if not months, after the last injection. So that's something you have to keep in mind when selecting your compounds for your next cycle. If you want to do a PCT and recover fertility or HPTA functioning, maybe avoid the progestogenic 19 NORs. I'll leave it here. Thank you guys so much for watching. You can find everything that I'm associated with down below in the description section. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok at VigorSteve. Have a look at my Vigorous Male Lab Panel over at Merrick Health if you want to stay on top of your health. We're trying to make a budget panel that's going to be a little bit cheaper than the full VigorSteve Male Lab Panel that is currently offered. So if you just want to do a routine checkup, stay tuned. It should be up later this week. Vigorous crew, you guys know what to do. A front double bicep for you guys. Currently Flurona free. Fingers crossed we can keep it that way. Going back to the gym tonight to kick some ass and chew bubble gum. And I'm all out of gum. See you guys in the next video.